Golden hour. It's a term that us as photographers know all too well, and I'm going to share with you why I think golden hour is the quickest way to ruin your photography. It's a very bold statement, I'm aware of that, a few people have already disliked this video, however, if you hear me out, let me explain why I think golden hour isn't the best way forward when it comes to your photography. I will also share some tips on how to shoot around this period of time that is actually a pair of golden handcuffs rather than golden hour. It should be called golden handcuffs because, well, you'll see why. When I first started photography, I was doing what you're doing right now, which is watching YouTube videos, reading blogs, and trying to learn as much as I possibly can. Soon enough, I come across a bunch of photographers who praised the golden hour. They said that if you want to get good photos, you need to shoot in good light, and good light only happens during that tiny sliver of time right after sunrise and just before sunset. So after consuming all of this information, I was convinced that in order for me to get ahead, I had to shoot during the golden hour. The problem was that I had a job like most of you do, and that meant 90% of sunrises were out the question and sunsets were only viable in the summer months later in the day. What that actually meant is that I didn't really shoot that much because any other time that I had for photography, well, the light's too harsh, the light's too dull, it's not going to work because it's not soft and golden. And those little nuggets of time that I did find myself with having availability and a golden hour, I was so preoccupied with planning where do I need to be, where is the light, then when I was actually on location I was rushing around because obviously during that period of time the light changes very quickly. And now and again, I did get some decent shots. However, when I got back and I looked at them, even the ones which were okay by today's standards, even maybe one or two, the main subject, the main point of interest was the light. It wasn't what was going on in the image, it wasn't the location, it wasn't the subjects, it wasn't the composition, it was the overpowering orange golden light in the image. All of this made me think that if I am to progress as a photographer, if I am to enjoy this craft long term and actually shoot, I had to stop shooting during golden hour because it was just wrecking my photography. And I'm pretty sure there are a small amount of people watching this video right now who might be in that position and going through the same thing as I went through because they listened to people who said you should only shoot during golden hour. So if that's you, let me share with you some advice on how to shoot in different lighting conditions. Now, this is not a deep dive into each topic. I've made videos about it separately. This is like the main stuff you need to know in order to get out there and shoot in harsh light, in dull, kind of diffused cloudy light like today, and at night. Because if you can shoot during golden hour, during harsh light, during dull light, and at night, you can shoot basically any time you want. We all know what harsh light is. It's that middle part of the day, the sun is high, it's direct, and the light is harsh. It's not soft, it's not diffused, and it can cause havoc to your images because the scene itself is harsh. But you could still get around it and you could still get good shots. As a matter of fact, harsh light is probably one of my favorite types of light to shoot in. And let me share with you the first and biggest piece of advice is the 180-degree rule, meaning that you want to be shooting into the shadow or into the brighter part of the scene. So if you're shooting, let's say, a car in front of you, the shadow of the car has to be coming towards you, or at least within that 180-degree radius in front of you, meaning the light has to be behind the subject or within that 180-degree radius. By having that shadow, you're adding depth to the image. When the sun is very high and the light is quite flat and harsh, you're losing depth. But by having that shadow facing you, you're adding a little bit of depth and a little bit of separation back into the scene, which will help you tremendously. The second tip is to not fight the contrast. On a harsh day, you will come across two types of lighting conditions or scenes. The first one is a very high contrast scene. Typically, you're shooting from a dark place into a brighter place. So you could be under a bridge, in a tunnel, between buildings, in a market. And also you'll have a very washed out scene. Let's say you're standing in a field. Let's say there's loads of greenery. It's a very open area and the sun is hitting everything quite evenly. That will typically be low contrast and washed out. You don't want to be fighting these scenes. So if you have a high contrast scene, whether you're shooting it or you're editing the photo later, you want to make sure you either exaggerate that contrast or you at least maintain it. Because the moment you reduce that contrast because you want to expose everything in the highlights and the shadows, the image becomes Instagram from 2015, very HDR-ish, not very pleasant and just not natural to your eyes. Same works for the other option, which is if everything is low contrast and you think, oh, it needs to be a bit more, contrasty. So you boost the contrast slider, but now everything looks a little bit crunchy and not particularly nice. And that's because you're fighting the natural contrast in the image. So instead of fighting it, embrace it, maybe exaggerate it if possible, and work with the natural contrast that you have. The next piece of advice applies a bit more to editing than to actually shooting. However, depending on how you work, this can also apply to in-camera adjustments. These are the two biggest levers that will either make or break your photo, and they are exposure and white balance. Typically, at least in my experience, whenever shooting bright, harsh daylight scenes, cameras tend to, one, slightly underexpose it, and two, have the image that's a little bit too cool. Now, mathematically speaking, that will be the correct exposure and that will be the correct white balance. However, creatively speaking, it would just not look the same as what your eyes have seen. In most cases, it will be, as I've said, a bit too cool and a bit too dark. So what I tend to do when editing raw files, and I mean JPEGs, it can work a bit, but this is more for raw files, is boost the exposure and slightly warm up the image in order to match what the file is with what your eyes saw on a day. And the final piece of advice for shooting on a harsh day is to use local adjustments when editing to fix problematic areas, because you will come across them, especially when the light is hitting different colored things and other aspects of the image being out of whack with the whole scene. A very common example is if you're shooting a beach, the actual sand might be too bright compared to the rest of the image, compared to the water, compared to the background, compared to the sky. So you want to use for example, a gradient adjustment in Lightroom to bring that exposure down and to bring it back in balance with the rest of the image. Another common example is having a sky that's too overpowering. It's too saturated, it's too blue, it's too dark. That's very common to get on a bright sunny day, so I personally use the color picker to just take that blue and slightly reduce it, slightly brighten it, and end up with a more balanced image. I'm losing my voice. Now let's look at dull light. It's a typical light you'll find on a boring cloudy day. If you live in the UK or in many parts of Northern Europe, you will see it quite often. You basically have a grey sky, and even though you have light, it's very flat, there's nothing going on, there's no colour, it's just a bit boring. For many photographers, and for me at one point, it was a very boring and a very kind of uninspiring light to shoot in. However, there are things you can do to make the most of it and to still walk away with some great images. So let me share with you a few tips to help you out. The first one is to seek contrast. When you have a flat grey sky, you are lacking in contrast. On a sunny day, you can use the sun to create contrast by shooting into it, but on a grey day, you don't have that. So what do? You have to find contrast in your environment. So if you're in a city, perhaps you can be shooting between buildings and you're standing in a darker place, shooting into a brighter place. Perhaps you could be shooting if you're in a tunnel or in a market. If you are even in a walkway or somewhere where you're in a darker area shooting into a brighter area. Not every photo needs to have that, but certainly it will go a long way towards starting to build something when the light is not particularly inspiring. The next tip is to overexpose. Now you can do it in Lightroom, but I personally do it in camera. I will just bump up the global exposure by 0.3, 0.6, sometimes +1, depending on just how dull it is. By overexposing, you are automatically bringing up the shadow detail and you're blowing out the sky, potentially. Some people will be like, oh my god, you can't blow out the sky, that's illegal, 10 years in jail. The problem is though, it's not a problem, but the thing is, there's nothing in the sky anyway. If you had some dramatic clouds, if you had something going on in the sky, by all means keep that detail. But if it's just a flat grey sky, if you leave that as flat grey in the image, it's gonna make your image look very dull. So what I tend to do is boost that exposure, as I've said, either in camera or in editing, and at least that way have a very visible, very strong shadow detail, and the sky is blown out. There's nothing there. It doesn't need to show you all the different shades of grey. Now I understand that's a very taste thing. Some people will look at this type of photography and say it's overexposed, it's rubbish. However, in my experience, I found those types of images to be a lot more compelling than those that seek to maintain every single pixel of grey in the sky. The next piece of advice is to seek out colour. When the sky is grey, when the light is grey, there's nothing going on. If you look for just monochromatic things, you will end up with a pretty boring image. So try to find little bits of colour. Now it could be subjects, it could be walls, it could be backgrounds. It doesn't really matter where the colour comes from, but try to seek out colour. When I'm walking around shooting on a cloudy day, I look for two things. The first is contrast, which I've already mentioned, but the second is colour. There's a person in a red coat, there's a red car, there's a green car, there is a yellow building, there is a post box. It doesn't really matter what it is, just look for colour and use that colour as an anchor point, as a starting point to try and build your image around it. Now, in most cases, it's not going to work. At the end of the day, if you find a bin that's bright pink, yes, it's colourful, but it doesn't mean it'll make a good subject. But by looking for colour, you can start to see if you can build an image around that colour that you see, and in turn and basically make a rather dull scene a little bit more cheery, I guess. And the final piece of advice is the one that will contradict the previous piece of advice, and that is to just go black and white. If you don't have any colour in your scene, if everything is monochromatic and it's all just grey and just dull, get rid of the colour, because unless you're going for a monochromatic image, let's say it's Blue Hour, having colour in that particular case is just going to distract from the image and going to make everything look a bit dull. By going black and white, you now have more room to play with the shadows and the highlights, the blacks and the whites, and create a more compelling, contrasty image compared to if you try to do that with colour. Because if you do that with colour, it's just not going to look natural, it's going to look quite bad. But if you do it with black and white, you can create some truly unique images that you physically couldn't do with a colour shot. Now let's move on to the final lighting condition, which is low light, shooting at night. Now this is quite a big topic, however there are a few key principles that if you follow, you will get 80% of the way there. The first one is to underexpose. It's counterintuitive, I know, however 99.9% of cameras will overexpose a night scene. If you drop that exposure by at least -1, the screen and the scene will match. An even bigger benefit of underexposing is you're protecting your highlights, because your highlights will be blown out during nighttime photography. Again, it's one of these things that's a bit counterintuitive, but when you have such bright lights and also such darkness, That amount of contrast and dynamic range many cameras can't get. So by underexposing, you're protecting the highlights, and you can then bring the shadows up later if you need to. However, as I've said, in many cases you might not even need to do that because it will be realistic to how your eyes are seeing the scene. The second piece of advice is to pretend to be a moth. A moth will naturally gravitate towards sources of light, and so should you. When you're shooting at night, the importance of having enough light is even more critical than during the day. Your camera still works in the same way, it requires light. So by seeking out areas in your city that have more light, you will put yourself in better position to get good shots compared to shooting somewhere that's completely dark. This is why places like Tokyo are so popular for night photography, because of all of the LEDs and all of the lights. This is why if you're in London, you'll find many night photographers are around the West End, Soho, Chinatown, because those areas are usually brighter than other parts of town at night. So find out where you have the most fluorescent light or window light or even street light. It doesn't really matter. Find sources of light, go towards them, and then work those areas around those sources of light. The next piece of advice is to get closer, because when you're shooting at night, you're dealing with a lot of detail. You have a bunch of stray reflections from windows, from walls, from shiny surfaces. There are a ton of different light sources bouncing around, and typically a wide night scene will be quite messy with a lot going on. Now, you might like that type of photography and that's great, but if you're like me and you prefer cleaner, more minimal compositions, you will have to get closer. That could be using your feet, or it could be using a longer lens. Personally, I love shooting with a 50mm lens at night because it gives me that kind of distance to get closer, but not have to get too kind of close and tight. However, for you, it might be an 85 or maybe a 35, it doesn't matter. I found it very helpful to try and get closer, focus on the details, and that would result in cleaner and more pleasing images, at least for me. Okay, well, I hope these tips have given you some ideas, some things to try when shooting in any period of time outside of the golden hour. Now, this video is not here to bash golden hour or those who enjoy shooting in it at all. It's still a magical time of day to get photos. The light's fantastic. There's a reason why it's so popular. However, it's here to tell you that you don't need to exclusively shoot in golden hour. And if you make a point of only shooting in golden hour, it becomes like a golden pair of handcuffs where you now can't shoot at any other time of day, which limits you severely. So by all means, enjoy golden hour, but don't think that it's the only time of day where you can get good shots, because as you've seen in this video, you can get good photos regardless of the lighting conditions if you know what you're doing. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Please leave your comments down below. I'm curious to hear your opinions about this topic. And that is it. I am not sure if this is going to be the last video of the year or not. If it is, then I wish you a happy new year, and I want to say a huge thank you for all your generous support by watching my videos, liking, subscribing, commenting throughout the year. I really do appreciate it. I don't take this for granted whatsoever. It's a privilege to be able to do this, and I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for you. So thank you a bunch for your support. And if there's going to be one more video, then I'll just probably repeat the thank you and the New Year's wishes one more time. But yeah, thank you again, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye. At this point, I want to quickly thank Squarespace for sponsoring this video. I've been a paying customer way before they supported the channel, and have now been using their services for over 5 years. Squarespace is at the center of my online presence, and it's what drives my blog, portfolio, store, and newsletter. I appreciate the simplicity of managing everything from a single app because it saves me time and gives me peace of mind knowing that I can make changes or deal with issues from my phone. If you have a business, a side hustle, or simply want your own little corner of the internet to host your photography or build something big, Squarespace offers all the tools you need across all devices. If you want to learn more, get a free trial and then 10% off your first purchase, use the link in the description or enter code RomanFox at checkout. Thank you again to Squarespace for sponsoring, and thank you for watching.